everyone, I'm Charlie from Dr. Wen, and welcome to another Doctor Who YouTube video. Today I will rank all 11 TV stories from Series 6 of New Who, so that's any series of Doctor Who from 2005 onwards. This will be the 7th video in a series of 13. I'll set a card here so you can check out the previous video in this series, where I rank all the TV stories from Series 5. So, I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about this series of Doctor Who in case you haven't watched it, and by the way, there will be a couple of spoilers, not major ones. The major one I won't reveal, but there will be some minor ones, so just be aware of that. So I'm going to be ranking all 11 Series 6 stories. That will be Impossible Astronaut Day of the Moon, Curse of the Black Spot, Doctor's Wife, Rebel Flesh Almost People, A Good Man Goes to War, Let's Kill Hitler, Night Terrors, The Girl Who Waited, The God Complex, Closing Time, and The Wedding of River Song. That's 13 episodes, but 2 are two-parters, making it 11 TV stories. So I will not include the 2010 and 2011 Christmas specials which surround it. This series is the 11th Doctor's middle series, or second series, and he travels with companions Amy, Rory and the River. Although River isn't in all of the episodes, she is in enough to be classed as a companion for this series. It also features new villains, the Silence, and returning villains, the Cybermen, in The Wedding of River Song and Closing Time, respectively. So let's start off this list with my least favourite in this series. The only one in the series I would say I don't like, Closing Time, with a score of 5.5. The main reason why it's so low down is because it's not very memorable. When someone mentions Doctor Who to me, I definitely do not picture this. I picture, not all of them are good, the ones I picture, but I definitely don't picture this. I don't really like Craig in this. My favourite version of him is in The Lodger, definitely. It's got a pretty weird plot. It's quite confusing how we don't know if the spaceship is in space or underground, or the cyber factory is quite weird. It's not really explained how the Cybermen got there in the first place, especially since they have roughly the same design as Cybus Industries from Series 2, which doesn't really make much sense because they're from Parallel Earth. Although I do still like this design, they have made a couple of modifications from Series 2 design. It's still quite good. Overall, this isn't a very good episode, and not one I definitely want to watch again. So, in 10th place is Night Terrors, which I've given a 6.2. This one is definitely a step up from Closing Time. It's got a lot more good things about it, equally as many bad things about it. It's got a fairly bad setting. The whole small flats kind of thing's quite boring, and I don't know, it just doesn't look very nice. It's got lots of cliches in it, like we're inside a doll's house, we're miniaturized, don't press the button to go to the bottom of the elevator shaft kind of thing. Things like that. And it's a bit silly how the old woman gets pushed into the rubbish bags. I don't really see the whole point of that. And it's actually a pretty creepy episode, in a good way. The peg dolls are really creepy, and the scenes where anyone gets turned into one is actually quite frightening. But they could be a better design, just to make them more creepy. They could have actual eyes. That would definitely be really scary. So in 9th place we have Curse of the Black Spot with 6.9, another big step up from Night Terrors and Closing Time. The main thing about this episode is that I prefer the first half a lot more than the second half. If the entire episode was like the first half, creepy base under siege story set on a pirate ship with a siren, it would be a lot higher. But the second half's really weird with how the siren's like a doctor and stuff, and there's like another ship there, but it's not there at the same time. But it's quite weird. The main thing I like about this episode is the first part where the siren is picking everyone off one by one. I really enjoy those episodes. But overall, it's actually fairly memorable, and fairly solid story that holds up quite well. So in 8th place we have The Rebel Flesh and the Almost People, the worst two-parter in the series, with 7.3. One of the main reasons I don't like this episode that much is because, well, I think you're looking at it right now. The flesh is really weird, and I don't know, it's just a bit silly the things it can do. It just doesn't really make that much sense. It's also, I don't want to sound really picky about this, but it's got incredibly bland colours. The only colours in it are orange, black, grey and brown. It's really dull actually, and I don't think it should have been a two-parter. I feel like its only purpose is filler and to set up A Good Man Goes to War. That's pretty much all it does. I still quite like the idea of the Flesh rebelling against their original people. I quite liked that. And it was actually really sad when the original people died because of their flesh, and the flesh, took over. I thought that was quite a weird concept, but I liked it. And I just wish it was... expanded on a bit more, the whole rebellion thing. It should have been a more simple story if it was a one-parter, or if it was still a two-parter, then I think it should have been... the rebellion should have been explained a bit more. So, we're moving up a lot now. We've got The Doctor's Wife in 7th place with a 7.7 out of 10. I know I'm being very specific with these, but I'm just trying to... you could time this by 10 and make it a percentage. But I quite like this episode. It's obviously a step up from the others, and I mainly like it because of the scenes where Amy and Rory are trapped on the TARDIS, which has been taken over by an evil sentient entity, and it's really good because of the whole messing with Amy and Rory's heads things, how Amy couldn't see but Rory could, and where they saw the other person, but in a really old version, who hated them. I thought that was actually really dark and creepy. Definitely one of the darker episodes of this series, but I actually quite like it. I don't really like Idris, the embodiment of the TARDIS. I thought that could have been improved on a little bit more. But I still quite like the whole concept of the TARDIS actually being a person. But this is still a pretty good story and holds up quite well. Next is The God Complex in 6th place with an 8.2. This episode I have very mixed feelings on. It's sort of a Base Under Siege episode, for the starting anyway. It's the Minotaur picking off people one by one, making them go insane, making them say praise him. That's actually really weird and creepy, and it didn't really get explained that much, which I think this should have been a two-parter, and the Rebel Flesh Almost people should have been a one-parter. I think that would have been better. The ending is quite weird, how the hotel isn't a hotel at all, and it's in space, and the whole thing kind of opens up and it's revealed to be a void. I thought that was quite odd. The Minotaur was a very good villain. We don't actually see that much of him, but it's a really good idea, actually. I quite like the entire concept of there's a room with everyone's worst fears. I'm surprised they didn't do it earlier with the Russell T Davies era. But I wish this was a two-parter, but it was still a really good story. So next up in 5th place we have a very controversial episode of this series called Let's Kill Hitler. You can probably guess why it's so controversial. I mean, they accidentally save his life, which, I don't know, I don't think that was the best idea. I wish that he wasn't in it at all and it was just set in Germany in that time period. I don't really see the need for all that. But this could have been set in any place and time and still would have worked. Especially, I think modern day would have been really interesting for this as well. They didn't really need to have it set then, but I think this is an incredibly underrated episode. I've given it an 8.6, but I've heard other people give it 3s and 2s, which is insane. My lowest rated story of Doctor Who is a 4.9. I quite like the Tesselector. It sets up the wedding of Riversong quite well, because the Doctor hides in there at some point, and I think it made for quite an interesting plot device. It's not exactly a villain as such, but it's still quite good. River is interesting in this episode, how she was Mel's and then she wasn't. It was interesting how she managed to escape Madame Kovarian and be Amy and Rory's friend and try to make them meet. I think that was quite interesting, and it was quite confusing until she regenerated and it all made sense. So it's a very fast-paced episode as well, how they're going around the city, chasing the Tesselector and River, and it was quite scary when the Doctor was going to die. But then I realised he didn't, because he pretended to, sort of, in the Impossible Astronaut, Day of the Moon, and The Wedding of River Song. It's also an incredibly underrated episode, but I think it's actually really solid and one of the best stories of this series. In fourth place we have The Wedding of River Song, the one-part finale, which I really wish would have been a two-part finale. I think the previous finales were all two parts, and they worked really well, and I think it was a bit of a risk going for a one-part. I don't believe closing time should have existed, and this should have been a two-parter instead. But it's quite a confusing episode. I have very mixed feelings, because originally I didn't really know why I liked it so much, but now I sort of do. It's a bit complicated, yes, with the whole bubble universe, like what would have happened if River hadn't have killed the Doctor and rewritten a fixed point in time, creating all time happening at once. That was really good. It was a 45-minute way of explaining he was in the Tesselector, but I still loved it all the same. And the whole thing with Amy knowing who the Doctor and Rory were, but Rory not knowing, I thought that was quite confusing, like, what's happened to Rory? And it explains when the Doctor and River got married. The entire title of the episode is The Wedding of River Song. And I do quite like the idea of the bubble universe as well. It's a really good story, I think. Incredibly underrated. Not one of the best finales, but still up there. In third place we have the two-part first story of this series, Impossible Astronaut and Day of the Moon. I think this is a really good episode, why I've given it a 9.2. It's sort of a horror episode, especially in the second part, because of the silence and how the tally marks kept on appearing on Amy, but she didn't remember putting them there. And I quite liked how River, in the first part, was pretending not to know the Doctor sort of died. It was very confusing, but it was all explained in The Wedding of River Song. I really like having a new big bad, and it's not just Cybermen, Daleks, or the Master. I think the Silence were a very good choice to go with. And it's a bit complicated, but in a very good way. Finally, we're getting on to the two best stories, and this is The Girl Who Waited with a 9.3. This is where they land on a planet called Appalachia, which is in worldwide quarantine, basically, quite fitting with the current situation, sort of, and basically Amy is trapped there for 36 years, but there are two versions of Amy, one of which has been trapped there for like a couple of weeks, another which has been trapped there for years. It's really emotional, actually, having Rory decide which wife he wants, the one who's been trapped there for 36 years, or the one who was trapped there for a couple of weeks. And I quite like the Handbots as villains. It's quite interesting seeing them, since they do just want to help. They don't think of themselves as villains, unlike the Daleks and Cybermen. And this is a bit of filler, actually, because it doesn't contribute to the overall plot, but it's good filler. Just because it's filler doesn't mean it's bad. And I quite like the whole concept of two streams. I think that was quite interesting, seeing the time travel continuity. Anyway, in first place, if you've been keeping track, is A Good Man Goes to War with a 9.5. This was the finale of the first part of the series. It was kind of split into two, with a month gap between the two series. And there is one word to describe this, and that is epic. It's the papal mainframe with the Silence of Madame Kaverian trying to kill the Doctor because he was really dangerous as a Time Lord. It introduces the Paternoster gang with Vastra, Jenny and Strax. I thought that was quite good, and I quite like how the Doctor actually lost in this, because the baby was flesh and Madame Kaverian got her and programmed her to kill the Doctor. Oh yeah, spoilers. There was a big reveal at the end of this episode. I'm not going to say what it was, because this is probably the biggest spoiler for this series, and I like how it explored the consequences of him time travelling too much, going to too many places. As River said, he got too big. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed recording it, and make sure to subscribe. Only 55% of you are subscribed. I'm not going to force you to, but I really appreciate it if you did. And I'll be back tomorrow with another episode of this series, the 8th entry in it, where I will rank all of the TV stories in Series 7 of Doctor Who. It's one of my favourite series. Stay tuned for that, and goodbye.